And I think that my hope is that my spread of the knowledge and my love and passion for these creatures helps get the public more engaged to the point where we can afford more research funding for them, just because they're vital creatures, just like bees are. And they're doubly vital because they not only pollinate, but they also are important predators and parasitoids of insects that keep the population in check. And one of the things I've talked about with pollination and wasps is that pretty much every pollinator does so by accident. They're not purposely pollinating.
From the University of Massachusetts Amherst Extension Service, this is PolliNation, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Nicole Bell, pollinator specialist and extension educator in the Center for Food, Agriculture, and the Environment. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to PolliNation. I'm so glad you're here with us today, and I could not be more excited to delve into an often underdiscussed and underrepresented topic, that is wasps. I know I spend so much time in my professional and personal life thinking about bees, which are a very popular group in the pollinator world alongside butterflies. But in the very same order as bees, Hymenoptera, we have wasps, which are an incredibly diverse and fascinating group of insects. And who better to start this conversation with than the one and only That Wasp Guy on Instagram, Sloan Tomlinson. Sloan Tomlinson is a science communicator, photographer, educator, and self-described autodidactic entomologist. Insects, and specifically wasps, have been a deep passion of his since childhood. However, it's only been in the last 10 years or so that passion somewhat exploded, and he's worked in earnest to try and spread the message about the importance of these insects. Sloan uses a mix of macrophotography, science communication, and a deep knowledge and understanding of these insects to help people work through their fears and learn to appreciate these vital insects. Sloan does a mix of work. This includes walkabouts, presentations, leading online courses, and just as a really valuable source of knowledge. And I hope that whether you're listening today, either as someone that may be apprehensive about wasps, or even if you're already someone that loves wasps, there's some really great information in today's conversation about not only the ecological knowledge around wasps, but how to talk about wasps in a way that's understanding towards people that may have had negative experiences or just don't know the questions to ask. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to PolliNation. I'm super excited to sit down today with Sloan Tomlinson, a science communicator who you might know as That Wasp Guy. And we're going to dive right in on a topic that I'm really interested in, and that's wasps, which are the focus of this episode today. And I'm going to get right into the meat of it and ask you what seems like a very basic question, which is, what is a wasp?
Yeah, it does seem to come across as an easy question, but it is a little bit more complicated. So a wasp is a member of Hymenoptera, just like bees and ants. However, taxonomically speaking, pretty much the entire order Hymenoptera are wasps, except for the sawflies. So sawflies are an ancient group of hymenopterans that have been around since the Triassic. And for millions of years, Hymenoptera was just sawflies. And sawflies are wasp-like creatures, but they lack a waist. They are all lay their eggs in plants. Their larvae are vegetarians. And somewhere along the line, parasitoidism happened, where some of these sawflies started developing the taste for laying their eggs in insects instead of plants. And from those parasitoids, the literally hundreds of thousands of wasp species have evolved. And one group of those were the aculeates. And the aculeates are the ones that can sting. And they are monophyletic, meaning that they have one single ancestor. And so somewhere along the lines, a wasp parasitoid wasp developed her ovipositor into a stinger. So she no longer laid eggs through it. Instead, she used it to inject venom. And it's from that single parasitoid wasp that had a stinger that all stinging wasps and all bees and all ants evolved. And so bees and ants are actually pretty much wasps themselves. Although they are different creatures, they did evolve from wasps. So wasp really just encompasses an insect in Hymenoptera that's not a sawfly.
Right. And so I remember too when I first started learning about bees, I was taken aback by the fact that, it used to, we used to hear 20,000 species for bees, and more recent updates project around 25,000 species for bees. And that was a virtually incomprehensible number to me when I first started. And wasps weren't even on my radar at that time.
Yeah.
And so, how many wasp species, if we take out bees, if we take out ants, if we take out the sawflies and just focus on what we consider wasps, how many species are there in the world?
Well, we currently know of around 135,000 species, but there are estimates as high as 800,000 to 3 million species. And that's predominantly because most wasps are not stinging wasps. Most wasps don't make nests. Most wasps are solitary parasitoids, and of those, many are very, very tiny, like the ones in my picture here, which are Terramallus species that parasitize butterfly pupa. And so these tiny wasps are just so vastly understudied, and also just because we just don't know about them because they're tiny. We don't come across them on a daily basis. And so the estimates range anywhere I've seen. The low end is 300,000, the high end is 3 million. And that's parasitoid wasps really make up that majority of that number.
Wow. Okay, so give me a range or an idea of the size range in wasps. So I know you just mentioned parasitic wasps can be tiny, tiny, tiny. So if we had to visualize how small they might get to the largest wasp we know, how big is this range in size?
It's absolutely enormous, actually. So the largest wasps in the world are a species of tarantula hawk called Pepsis hero, which I believe has about a 5-inch wingspan.
Wow.
It also includes Megascolia procera, which is a parasitoid scoliid wasp, which is the heaviest member of Hymenoptera, which has about a 4.5-inch wingspan. And then you go down to the parasitoid wasps. The smallest known flying parasitoid is a species of fairy fly or fairy wasp called Kikiki huna, which is an egg parasitoid from Hawaii, who is only about 150 microns in length. And to put
Oh my
that in
goodness.
perspective, three of them lined up would be the same size as a human egg.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
The-
And I heard too that to give people perspective that some of these wasps are so small that what we think of as wings, they don't even really have wings anymore, right? Like I've heard it described as them sort of almost like swimming through the air. They're so tiny that they don't even have these like bee-like or typical wasp-like wings that we think of.
That's correct. Yeah. So they have a lot of the very tiny wasps, especially the fairy wasps, have evolved so that their wings become kind of like paddles with long branching setae from them. So they basically swim through the air because they're less dense than the air is. So it's basically like they're swimming through honey for them.
That's so
They
crazy.
really don't have the ability to fly. And a lot of times they just get drifted by the wind. They get sort of dispersed that way, which is one of the reasons why it's also so hard to study their populations. So hard to study, their ranges, because they just spread so far and we barely find them.
Right. Okay. So we have like a base idea of wasps are an incredibly diverse group. And I know both of us are based in New England. So how many wasp species do we have in our area, either in Massachusetts or in New England, regionally, maybe even the US, to give us a sense of what we know is going on around us?
We easily have several thousand species of wasps in New England. Again, most of them are tiny parasitoids.
Yeah.
I don't have an exact figure on that one, but what we do have at least several thousand species here in New England. And of those 120 or 135,000 known species of wasp, I'd say a good 20,000 or more of them live in the United States. So we have a very wide range of species. Here in New England, even in the cold New England, we have them.
Yeah. And I know we'll get more into this later on the perception around wasps, but one thing I wanted to talk about too was the rise in interest in pollinators, in recent decades and the interest in conservation of pollinators. Bees and butterflies are two of the big groups we think of, but wasps are also important members of this group. And
Mhm.
one thing I think that's helpful for us to think about, or one thing that I know is helpful for me to decipher between the two groups and really start to separate out the difference, was the diet that bees and wasps grow up on typically. And so, could you talk a little bit about let's pick a wasp species, any wasp species in New England that you like, and take us through their life cycle. Let's start with the solitary species, which may require its own introduction since I know a lot of us think of wasps as social, but take me through a common solitary wasp in New England, the life cycle and what they eat.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll start off by saying that adult wasps, just like adult bees, only consume liquids. So an adult wasp is incapable of eating solid foods because of the way its mouth part is set up. So we oftentimes think of wasps as carnivores. We have to think of them tearing into flesh. But they have very powerful mandibles, but behind those mandibles, they have lapping mouth parts and a tongue, just like a bee does, because, as I said before, bees evolved from wasps. So they have the same mouth parts. But I'll pick a very popular, well-known species, which is the great golden digger, Sphex
One of my
ignominius.
favorites.
One of my favorites as well, and a very very obvious and also ubiquitous species here in New England. So these are large wasps, solitary wasps, and their life cycle is pretty much the same as most hunting wasps, solitary hunting wasps, which is the female seeks out prey. In her case, specifically katydids. She will hunt them down. She'll sting them just to paralyze them, not kill them, and then she'll drag it back to a nest. She creates burrows, usually multi-celled burrows that can be quite deep, and each cell will have a single egg and multiple katydids provisioned for the larvae. The female larvae will get more than the male larvae. And then the larvae will hatch in usually late summer, early fall. They'll begin consuming. They will then spin cocoons and they will remain as final instar larvae inside of their cocoons all winter. And then as soon as the soil starts to warm up, it triggers their response to pupate. They pupate and then they dig themselves out and emerge as adults. Males mate with the females, and the process starts all over again. And they fuel their very fast activities by nectar, primarily only nectar feeders. So you'll see them oftentimes on large composite flowers. They're very popular on Joe Pye weed, milkweed flowers. In fact, they're actually exceptional milkweed pollinators. And that's because milkweed, of course, creates a pollinia. So it has this sticky little pollen that for smaller pollinators, it would actually kill them because they wouldn't be able to fly with it.
Right.
But these large pollinators, like these Sphex ignominius and other Sphex species, we have two of the species in this genus in New England, Sphex ignominius, which is the great golden digger, and Sphex pennsylvanicus, which is the great black wasp, both of which you'll see on all kinds of large flowers. And I love seeing them too.
Yeah, mountain mint is actually one of my
Yep.
favorites to look at wasps. I often go to the Arnold Arboretum in
Mm.
Boston,
Yep.
and they have lots of butterfly weed, which is, like you mentioned, a great one to see them on. And then the mountain mint too is just covered. I've seen a lot of great black wasps specifically, and they're
Yeah.
beautiful.
Goldenrod is
Um,
also a good one for wasps. I find it's usually one of the best places to find wasps. Wasps color, the way that their vision works, they're actually a lot more attracted to yellow. than to the sort of the reds and the purples that bees might be more attracted to. So you oftentimes will find a lot of wasps on goldenrod all summer long while it's blooming.
Interesting. And we'll get, I'm going to save the social wasps. I have a lot of questions on social wasps that I'll get to in a second. But before I do that, I know we mentioned with the great golden digger wasp, they hunt katydids, but there's a large range. And one of the things I find really interesting about wasps is that some of them are really specialized at hunting a particular group. And
Yeah.
so, could you give us an idea of in New England the different examples of that and the specialized prey, and also the advantages that has for us too as people?
Yeah. Well, there are caterpillar hunters. So there are several genera of wasps that hunt caterpillars. And they mostly hunt caterpillars that are detrimental to our food, to our trees. So they're really good for controlling those populations. There are wasps that only hunt cockroaches, which nobody particularly cares for cockroaches.
Right.
We also have wasps that hunt stink bugs. So there's the five-banded stink bug hunter, Bicyrtus quadrifasciatus, and that's a very common wasp in New England. They only hunt stink bugs.
It's
Uh,
also a gorgeous wasp
it
with
is.
it has like what is it, bright green eyes?
It has pretty green eyes and then yellow and black stripes, and yeah, fairly large wasp, medium to large. And then, of course, my favorite wasp that got me started in wasp in the first place, which is Phecis speciosus, the eastern cicada killer, which is our largest species of wasp in New England. They are found in any habitat that has a good population of cicadas. And
Hmm.
the females hunt cicadas, which can oftentimes be many times their own size. And they actually will climb up trees and sort of narrow in where their nesting spot is and then glide towards the nest with it, which is pretty cool. So incredibly strong creatures. And I think one of the things that's amazing about the solitary hunting wasps is that there's such this energy that's put into mothership. So like they put all of their effort into procuring food and a nesting spot for their offspring.
Yeah.
Much like another maybe more advanced animals might do. And that's all they care about. They just care about creating that situation for their children, which I think is always a really cool thing that the wasps do, that they've evolved specifically to do too. So, like these solitary wasps have evolved to hunt such specific prey that their bodies have evolved in that way to help them benefit to do that. Like the genus Ammophila, were long, thin wasps. Their whole bodies are long, and they hunt caterpillars that they paralyze, and then the caterpillar kind of becomes stiff, and they hold the caterpillar parallel to their body, and then they run along the ground with it.
Hmm.
And so they've evolved this balance to be able to do that. And I think that's one of the things that's amazing about wasps is that you can see how evolution works because there's just such a variety of life cycles and such a variety of food sources for their young that they've evolved this like myriad of responses to that.
And one thing too that, when what I hear often too is, bees are so great, bees are so great. I don't like wasps because wasps sting and like wasps go out of their way to sting. And so, my response to that is oftentimes, well, A, which we'll talk about this later, wasps don't want to sting you, but also stinging is so pivotal to a wasp's life cycle, which is not necessarily the case for a bee because for wasps to reproduce, they have to sting. And so maybe you can touch on that. And then also another thread that goes along that is the wasp waste, which is another description you'll often hear to differentiate between wasps and bees because the stinging is so central to a wasp's life cycle.
Well, I will start off by saying that the wasp waste, as we call it, actually, the bees have it too. The
Hmm.
bees have that waste. They have a thin constriction between their abdomen and their thorax, which all of Apocrita has. So Hymenoptera is divided into two groups, Apocrita, which are the wasp waste, and then Symphyta, which is the sawflies. So even bees have the wasp waste. It's just sometimes harder to see with their fluff.
Interesting.
But the wasp waste evolved because for several reasons. They believe either it evolved with that first parasitoid wasp that evolved from sawflies, because sawflies lack a waist altogether. This goes from thorax to abdomen, where the parasitoidism probably was what caused it, because they needed to have their abdomen be more flexible in order to inject an egg into something that's moving, as opposed to just injecting it into a plant matter. And so that waste has existed for millions of years, and even the obviously ants can clearly have it, and bees have it too. It's just we don't really see it as often. But if you look at other wasps, their waste is similar to bees. Like yellow jackets, for example, don't have a thin constriction. They have a constriction, but it's not like, say the great golden digger, which is one thread-waisted wasp, which has a very long, thin petiole between its abdomen and its thorax. So yeah, I mean, the wasp waste is, I think, probably caused by that. There's other theories that it was caused by being able to fly better. It gives them more
Mm,
balance. But having that flexibility is important. It's also important in mating. So with bees and with wasps, the males need to have a more flexible abdomen to be able to reach around and copulate with the female. And in aculeates, so in stinging wasps, bees, and ants, males always have one more segment to their abdomen than females, and that one more
right.
segment allows them to be a little bit more flexible than the female.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. So, we're talking a little bit about diet and what they eat, and this is kind of a good, we'll obviously revisit solitary wasp, but especially as we get into the summer months here in New England, the common thing that you hear is, oh, I'm at a picnic and, well, oftentimes people will say bee, first of all, but,
Mm.
they're like, this bee, the bees are like always trying to come and take the meat. Or at the end of the summer, if you have fruit, they're coming and they're interested in watermelon or things like that. And so tell us wherever you want to start on that front, in terms of, someone comes up to you and they're like, oh, like I love bees, but they're so annoying and they always try and eat my ribs or whatever it is.
Well, I think it's social wasps that give people the misconception that wasps eat solid foods, because solitary wasps don't chew up their prey. They just sting it, they drag it back to a nest. Social wasps actually usually don't sting their prey, they actually just start chewing into it. So social wasps like yellow jackets, which are the ones that people always hate. Yellow jackets have very powerful mandibles, and they sort of are fit into two different groups. There are the scavenging yellow jackets and there are the predatory yellow jackets, both of which are not eating what they're eating. So it looks like
Right.
eating to us, and especially to somebody who maybe doesn't know any better, because they're chewing and they're ripping off stuff. But what they're doing is they're creating a mush of protein, which they then take back to the nest and they feed the larvae. The larvae survive only on protein. So, be it chewed up insect prey or your ribs or some leftover chicken or a carcass. And in return, the wasp larvae actually have a secretion that they give the workers, which is a sugary, basically syrup. And that's what the adults eat. So the adult workers feed the larvae, and in return, they get this sugary liquid. And so what that does is it reinforces for the adults, oh, I can keep feeding this larva because it's going to give me my food, which is the sugary liquid that I need to survive. And so it kind of goes back and forth like that. They give it the protein, the larvae gives it the sugary stuff. And if the larva doesn't give a sugary liquid, the wasp will actually eject it from the nest because they assume it's sick or something, it's dying or
Hmm.
something like that. And so adult yellow jackets and paper wasps and other social wasps also only subsist on sugary liquids. They again don't have the ability to swallow solid foods. Sometimes queens, which we'll find around this time of year, will actually chew up prey and they'll lap up some of the juices. And they do this to create eggs. It helps them produce eggs because they need those minerals and proteins that they don't get out of sugars. But adult wasps are mostly feeding on, adult social wasps are mostly feeding on that sugary solution from the larvae, on sap, on nectar. And so they are pollinators, and you will see them on flowers a lot, especially later in the summer. And what happens later in the summer, where the yellow jackets seem like all of a sudden they're becoming more of a problem, is
Hmm.
because the colony is collapsing at that point. So what's happened late summer into fall is that there are not enough larvae for the amount of adult workers. So the workers are bringing food back to the nest, but they're not getting the sugary solution from the larvae because there's just not enough larvae to feed. And so they're desperate for sugar. And that's when you start seeing them on your soda, on your beer, on your rotting fruit, on anything
Hmm.
that contains a lot of sugar, they're going to be attracted to it, or hummingbird feeders, etc. So I always try to say that they're out of work sugar addicts.
Yeah.
So they're just then, and the workers, of course, all die in winter. So they're just looking for their last quote unquote fix
Right.
before their eventual demise.
Right. So I know I talk a lot about native bees and queen bumblebees this time of year. We're recording this in early May. And, last week I was out looking at a lot of rhododendrons, tons of queen bumblebees out. So tell me about the social bee life cycle. And just like we did for the solitary bee, pick a common social bee that we have here in New England.
Wasp, you
And
mean?
it might be and it might be helpful too to tell us because I know we've got a big mix here of native and non-native social wasps, or at least that's my understanding. And so tell us a little bit about that and then take us through starting in spring in this time of year what a queen does and then the life cycle of the colony and when we might expect peak abundance and then the decline.
Yeah. So we do have a good number of social wasps here in New England, most of which are native. We have three non-native species in New England. We have a Vespa crabro, which is a European hornet, which are quite large wasps. They've been here since the 1800s, and they were arrived actually first in Massachusetts by accident, and then
Oh,
it was actually during the initial scourge of the spongy moth. People actually wanted them because they were hoping that they'd get rid of the spongy moth, which of course they didn't.
mm.
But
Is that the
so
same
they've
as
been
the
around.
bald-faced hornet? Or is
No,
it a
no.
different?
So bald-faced hornets technically are not hornets. Bald-faced hornets are actually yellow jackets, and according to ESA, they are actually now classified as bald-faced aerial yellow jackets to sort of get rid of the confusion. So a
Interesting.
lot of times, hornet refers to large wasps, and obviously, when Europeans, specifically the English, first came to the United States, they saw large wasps. They just called them hornets. But hornet is a specific genus, which is Vespa, which is an old world genus that doesn't exist in Americas at all. And so
Interesting.
bald-faced hornets are actually yellow jackets. European hornets are much larger. We don't really have them here in Western Mass. They're mostly in Eastern Mass. They become much more common further south, but we do have them in New England. They're just not particularly common. We also have Vespula germanica, which is the German yellow jacket, which has also been here since the 1800s. And then we have Polistes dominula, which is the European paper wasp, which actually has been very problematic as an invasive species, something that people don't really talk about because people don't really care about whether wasps are being affected. But this
Right.
this non-native paper wasp has actually infiltrated both sides of the United States and is causing decline in native paper wasps because they have a much larger colony cycle. They're more aggressive in their nesting spots. They take all the food. And
Mm.
so we've seen declines in native paper wasps. And here in New England, we only have one native paper wasp, which is Polistes fiscatus, the northern paper wasp. And if you go farther east here in Massachusetts into Eastern Mass, you'll see less and less of them and more of the European because the European really likes urbanized areas.
Interesting.
But yeah, but the life cycle is the same as bumblebees, pretty much. So queens are, born in late summer, early fall, and they emerge and leave the nest at the same time that males are emerging. They find a mate, they mate, and then the queen will find some spot to overwinter, similar to bumblebees, old animal burrows, under loose logs, bark, inside of homes, any place that's out of the basic elements of winter. And then in spring they emerge. And for most species here in New England, they start their nest all alone. just like bumblebees. So they find a good nesting spot. They start creating the nest out of chewed up wood, and they lay their first eggs, and they will raise those first larvae to adulthood. And once they're adults, the queen will no longer leave the nest, and she'll remain there just laying eggs. And eventually, over time, she lays lots and lots of eggs. The workers become more and more. By midsummer, into mid to late summer, you start having peak, and that's when you have the most amount of adult workers. And it's around that time that the queen starts dying. And in some species, she's killed by her workers, by her daughters. And that's mostly because they start seeing her as not really viable to the nest.
Hmm.
And just like with bees, workers, of course, can't mate, but they can lay male eggs. And so the workers will sometimes kill the queen to lay their own male eggs so they won't have her male eggs because they'll be more closely related to their sons than they will be to her sons because of the fact of haplodiploidy. So that the fact
Right.
those of your listeners that don't know about Hymenoptera, the entire order is haplodiploid. So males emerge from unfertilized eggs and contain half the genes of their mother, and that's it. And females emerge from fertilized eggs, and so they have male and female genes. And so once the queen starts laying male eggs, they assume, okay, she's run out of, stored sperm. She's not going to lay any more workers. So they sometimes kill her, lay their own eggs. Queens are picked by the workers, just like with bees. The queens are just sort of randomly picked. This larva is going to be fed more, it's going to get larger, and eventually it becomes a queen.
Wow.
And then this process starts over again.
Interesting. So, one thing I wanted to touch on too is that this time of year, again, we're recording in May. So I'll get a lot of questions on social wasps specifically. Well, the first thing I want to ask actually is we started talking a little bit about this invasive paper wasp versus our native paper wasp. And is it easy for people to identify between the two if they were to see them?
A- Absolutely 100%. Our native paper wasps are brown, sometimes with red spots in the abdomen, but they're overall kind of brown. The other common name for the species is dark paper wasp. And here in New England, their color forms are mostly very dark. Sometimes out east and further south, you'll feel different color forms of them, but here in New England, they're very dark. Whereas the European paper wasp is colored like a yellow jacket. So it's bright yellow and black, and it has bright orange antennae. So it's very easy to tell the difference between the two of them. I will
That's good.
say, just because you see them doesn't mean you should kill them because it's very they've been around for a long time. We're not going to control things by just wantonly killing things, especially if people don't know what they're killing.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So one question that I get a lot is, I have this paper wasp colony that's in my doorway and or it's in my walkway or I don't want my kids to get stung. So there's all these, lots of different cases where wasps have established a home that's close to us and that can create conflict. And so talk to me a little bit about when is when is the worst time to try and get rid of a wasp colony? When do you know you've waited too long or you've caught it at the wrong time? And this time of year, again, I know people probably won't be listening to this until it's a little bit further along, but for next year's sake, if someone wanted to be ecologically friendly, they want to avoid harming wasps, but they say, I don't really want a colony, in my front doorway area. What can people do to safely control them and encourage them to establish a home elsewhere?
So yeah, so this time of year is actually the best time of year to combat that. So into depending on the year here in New England, April to May is when they start emerging from their hibernation. They start looking for nesting spots, and they'll start establishing nests. If you see a nest near some place where you don't want it to be at this time of year, so in a doorway or near your kid's play set or anywhere that you wouldn't want them to be, you can just remove it while the queen is away, because at this point, it's usually just going to be her. And
Mhm.
so she will not be on the nest at all times. If you remove it quick enough, then she'll eventually move on and find another spot. Sometimes she will definitely return to the spot because wasps use landmarks to kind of differentiate where their nesting site is. And they will also use pheromones. And so one of the things you can do is you can use a very strong smelling something that's going to last for a while and sort of spray it on the area where the wasp nest was. And that will
Mhm.
disrupt her pheromones, and she will start thinking maybe this isn't where I put my nest. And eventually she'll move on. Once you start seeing multiple members at a nest, it's going to become much more complicated. Once there's adult workers, it becomes much more difficult to remove it safely. And it also is much less likely to survive, even if you did remove it safely and put it someplace else,
Right.
just because they're going to be all attached to that particular area. So I always tell people during the springtime, what you should do is keep an eye around your deck, around your kids' play set, around your sheds, anywhere that you wouldn't want a wasp nest. Also, fill in old animal burrows in your yard and check your foundation and your sidings for cracks because that's where yellow jackets will nest. And so just making sure that you're filling in those areas, getting rid of any paper wasp nests as they're being started, or baldface as well. Baldface obviously make the aerial nest and they will start off with like a little golf ball sized nest. And if those will always be just by themselves. And until that nest becomes slightly larger and has a tube hanging from it, there are no adult workers. It's just her.
Hmm.
So whenever you
Interesting.
see that little,
What's the tube?
the tube, once she creates a tube, it's because she has pupa. And the
Mm.
tube is actually designed to help prevent parasitoids and predators from getting into the nest. It gives them a sort of
Huh.
a narrow entry point that you can guard a little bit better. Because there are parasitoids of bald-faced.
Interesting.
There's a wasp eat wasp world out there. So there are parasitoids of every single social wasp we have out here.
Interesting. And are there wasps that specialize in hunting other wasps for insect prey, or are there, because I know of the bee wolves, so we have a group of wasps that hunts bees, but do we have any wasps that are hunting each other or just parasitizing each other?
There's only parasitoids. There are no wasps that hunt other wasps. That being said, some species of yellow jacket, including baldface, will hunt other wasps for prey for for their larvae. Baldface are actually exceptionally good at hunting things on the wing. They prefer flying insects as prey. It's
Huh.
one of the reasons why people think of them as aggressive because they fly very rapidly and they're loud and they're fast and they move around erratically. And they do that because they have to catch prey in the air.
Hmm.
And so they will sometimes capture smaller yellow jackets, but there's no wasps, at least to my knowledge, anywhere that specialize in hunting other wasps. Definitely bees, as you said, the bee wolves.
Interesting. So we've talked a little bit about social wasps, solitary wasps, and, safely discouraging social wasp nests in areas where you might come into contact with them a lot. But I also want to talk about encouraging and creating wasp nesting habitat. And I'm based in the Boston area, so I'm in a really urbanized area where, like you said, you're in a fragmented environment where certain and select species do really well, other species are at a disadvantage. And so most of the wasps, like we've talked about, are solitary and very docile, and even the social wasps don't want anything to do with us, but it's this situation essentially we've put them in where we are now encroaching on their habitat, and we feel like they're encroaching on ours. So what can we do to encourage, especially for the majority of the wasp species that we have that are solitary, and a lot of them live in the ground? What are some things that we can do, and where do they like to create nests?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I always stress to people is even if you have a very small yard, trying to plant native flowers specifically. Habitat loss is one of the things that been detrimental to obviously all insect species, but adult wasps need those nectars to survive. And also nesting spots depends on the species, but creating sandy spots in your yard Most ground nesting wasps prefer a sandier soil than a denser soil. You also, the bee hotels that exist, they're called bee hotels, but plenty of wasps use them as well. So there's a lot of solitary wasp species that we have here that nest in pre-existing holes. If you buy those, I recommend making them and not buying them.
Right.
A lot of them are not made properly. They're covered in who knows what kind of chemicals. It's better just to find some hollow reeds. You can take logs and drill deep holes in them, and that will attract bees as well. But also, plenty of wasps use those nesting holes. We have quite a few species that would use them. But also, sometimes you can create sort of some log piles, things like that, that will help them kind of find places to hide. Basically, kind of like naturizing your yard as much as you possibly can, depending on where you are, or creating a quote unquote bee hotel, a bee and wasp hotel. There are plenty of resources online to see how to make them yourself, and I highly recommend making them rather than purchasing them just because, they're
Yeah, you
they're
never
not
know.
that
We
fun.
actually we actually just made a handout on creating a bee hotel. 'Cause yeah, sometimes, you get if you buy a bee hotel, they can be like glued to the back wall. They can be made out of materials that'll even like cut their wings as they're passing through. So, and it's fun. It's fun to make them. I think it's a great educational
Yeah.
activity as well. So, providing alternative nesting substrate. This is something that sometimes comes up with eastern large carpenter bees is which obviously they're excavating in wood. But, one thing I often say to people is that a lot of the times it's because we've created these really ideal wood structures in a habitat where they've lost a lot of their other nesting opportunities. And so is it similar for wasps where, it's helpful to provide alternative nesting substrate when you're trying to discourage them? I mean, I know they find their way where they find their way. So it doesn't mean you won't find any nests where you don't want them, but I'm sure providing alternative options is more helpful than not.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that if you can provide any kind of options, I mean, I think one of the things about insect ecology is that I think that the general public tends to kind of get fixated on a singular species or, the popular kids, as I call them, things like honeybees and monarchs and stuff. But it's like the problem is that, insects as a whole really need to be taken care of, and they're all declining. And so creating these kind of nesting spots or just creating wild spaces as much as you can. It doesn't have to be your whole yard, but just creating a small section of your yard to do that.
So you just kind of talked about this, but one thing I really wanted to get into is, I've most of my research background and, going through my education was really focused on bees. But now in the role that I do at UMass, I'm Pollinator Extension. So I theoretically
Mhm.
cover all sorts of pollinator groups. And so I've really learned and tried to learn as much as I can about wasps since being here. And what's really stood out to me, as we've mentioned, is there's this really interesting phenomenon that's happened where as these taglines for pollinators have emerged and save the bees and save the pollinators, even all of these things come out, what comes to most people's mind is, like you said, a honeybee or a monarch. Bumblebees are really sort of the big three that I think of and that I see. And oftentimes it's really not people's fault because
Yeah.
growing up, the media that we see is really focusing and spotlighting those particular groups and even demonizing insects like wasps in other groups. And so this is obviously makes things much more complicated when we're trying to do conservation work or trying to do educational outreach and you have people say I really want to create habitat to help bees but I don't want any wasps or I don't want to encourage any wasps. And so what you just kind of said, it speaks to that, where if you create habitat for one thing, even if you create habitat with bees in mind or even honeybees in mind, you'll see other insects there because it is sort of a if you build it, they will come. So in that on that side of the coin, it's great because people may do a thing hoping they'll just get one type of insect, but it often does benefit others. But I was I was scrolling through. I mean, your Instagram is amazing. Amazing photos if you are listening and you haven't looked at it yet. And I was also reading through some of your comments as well. And it is really fascinating how, I think as an entomologist myself and someone who works very closely with other entomologists, it's easy to sort of get in a little echo bubble where you're like, oh, everybody like is coming around to this. Everybody's starting to like wasps and everybody's seeing things differently, but that's certainly not the case. And it's still a really big challenge. And so I'm curious in hearing more about your approach. And also, too, just as an aside, I mean, you touched on this very early, but it's a very real, this perception we have of wasps has real consequences in terms of their conservation and research funding and what you spoke to about how there's so much we don't know about wasps. And when people don't like a creature or actively dislike or even say they hate a particular group of insects, it creates less momentum for things like research funding, which we've seen the flip side of that for bees, which has been amazing, where there has been this big push of like, we need to understand these creatures better. We need to understand how pesticides impact not just honeybees, but let's start looking at native bees because they all respond differently. They're not all the same. And so, big way to ask, how has this experience been for you in terms of choosing to really focus on wasps, and what positive changes have you seen, and then where do we still really need to work, and what's missing in a lot of education and outreach right now?
I mean, I think you touched on some really good things there. I mean, it is unfortunate. I mean, insects in general, I think, are a difficult sell for the vast majority of people. I was part of a symposium at ESA in 2020 talking specifically about how social media was sort of helping the average person sort of appreciate insects more because entomology as a field is, vastly underappreciated. I
Right.
mean, there are so few entomology degrees left in this country. I mean, I live here in the Five College area, and none of them offer entomology as a degree. So, you can't, and UConn has dropped it, and they were the last place around here that I think was offering it as a degree. And
Yep.
that's, I think, I've spoken to people who are academic entomologists, and I think part of the problem is that in this country, it's very hard to find jobs with a degree, even an advanced entomology degree. So I think it's
Mhm.
getting people interested in insects in general is important. And so I think that wherever they start, be it with the honeybees and monarchs, that's great. They're kind of like the gateway drugs to insects.
Yeah.
People like the cute caterpillars and the pretty butterflies, and that if that gets them interested, then maybe they'll start learning about the ones that aren't as cute and fluffy.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that I mean I've been doing this for a long time, and wasps are something that I've loved since I was a kid. And it was actually getting stung by a wasp that got me interested in them. And I appreciated the sort of underdog quality that they had. And so that's one of the reasons why I continue to do what I do with the science communication and outreach that I do about wasps, is to try to get the general public more engaged and more interested. And you're always going to have those haters that come on and say, "Oh, I hate wasps. They should all die. They're not worth anything." Blah 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 blah. And that's something I've been dealing with posting through social media outlets for years now. I mean, I
Hmm.
post the most mundane thing about a wasp, and all of a sudden it's like I hate all of them and F this and F that, and
Hmm.
it's interesting that the kind of visceral reaction that it creates with people, because obviously no one likes getting stung. It's not fun,
Hmm.
but it's also not really that awful. You know, bee and wasp allergies, true anaphylactic allergies, are very rare. It's a very small percentage of the population that has that. So unless you have that, just get on with your day. Um, I mean, I've been stung out in the field more by bees than I have by wasps,
Oh, me too.
hands down. I've actually, the only time I've ever had an insect, stinging insect come at me was actually, and to sting me was a bumblebee that I caught accidentally in my net when I was trying to
Mm.
catch a wasp. And she flew out of that net, flew up in the air, and flew straight towards my face and stung me in the ear.
Oh,
So, I mean, these are just creatures trying to defend themselves. But it's a very hard sell. And the positive thing is that I have had people reach out to me and they've said things like, oh my God, I hated wasps. I was afraid of wasps, but your posts have really like changed my mind and I see them more, appreciate them more. Or even going so far as to say like, I just held a wasp the other day and I couldn't believe I was able to do that. And it wasn't for your posts, I wouldn't have been able to do that.
mm,
So knowing that I'm reaching some people, it makes me happy. But I mean, going back to the studying and the sort of like research available, as you said, like, it's hard to find research funding
mhm.
for insects. And the bees obviously have gotten a big push with the push for pollination. But wasps are still, it's hard to find research money for them. I know a lot of people that are academic entomologists that work with wasps, and they don't get that much funding. And it's partially like, we talked about the tiny little parasitoid wasps. The reason we don't know about that many of them is because there's only a handful of people studying them. I can
Right.
guarantee that I am probably only like one or two steps away from every hymenopterist in the world that studies wasps because there's so few of them.
Yeah.
And I think that's an unfortunate thing, but it's like even amongst entomologists, getting people to like wasps is tricky. Because I mean, I've met entomologists that hate wasps too. So,
Yeah.
um, and it's just hard because people have that preconceived notions that they've developed through their peers, through their parents, through excuse me, through a bad experience one time. You know, we get stung, and all of a sudden, that's the worst thing that's ever happened in my life, and I'm going to remember that forever, especially for kids when it happens. And I think that just the demonization of them continues to be fed by everybody around them. You say, I
Hmm.
hate wasps, you're going to have like 100 people hold their hands up and say, me too. You're going to
Hmm.
have only a handful of people say, wait a minute.
Right.
And I think that's the problem that happens with them. And I think that my hope is that my spread of the knowledge and my love and passion for these creatures helps get the public more engaged to the point where we can afford more research funding for them, just because they're vital creatures, just like bees are. And they're doubly vital because they not only pollinate, but they also are important predators and parasitoids of insects that keep the population in check. And one of the things I've talked about with pollination and wasps is that pretty much every pollinator does so by accident. They're not purposely pollinating. Bees aren't
Mhm.
like in the cartoons, like cheerfully gathering pollen and going, here you go, friendly flower. Thank you. They want food. And the
Hmm.
flowers have evolved to take advantage of that. And that's true for all pollinators pretty much except for wasps. One group of wasps, the fig wasps. So fig wasps are the only creatures that pollinate figs, and figs are vital keystone species in jungles. Without figs, jungle ecosystems would collapse. Every fig has its own species of wasp that pollinates it. Tiny little minuscule wasps that actually, when the females emerge and they mate with the males inside the fig that they're born in, they have a little pocket in their thorax and they actually stuff pollen. They take pollen and they stuff it into their thorax, a little pocket, fly to their next fig, and they lay their eggs in some of the flower ovaries and pollinate some of the other ones. And they do so because if the fig isn't pollinated, the fig tree will drop it and obviously kill their
Mm.
babies. So one could argue that it's a wasp that's the only pollinator that does it on purpose.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I know I've heard of fig wasps, but I hadn't heard they have a special little pouch.
Yep. Little pollen
That's
pouch.
fascinating.
So I think that's one of the things also is getting kids more engaged in it because I think we develop these fears and hatreds of insects as children. It's not
Yeah.
something that we learn as adults. It's something that we learned at an early age. And so getting kids involved, I think, is really important. And not teaching your kids to be afraid of them.
Yeah.
Don't just go, watch out, be careful. Oh my God, it's gonna attack you. Like, don't do
Hmm.
things like that. Just be like, hey, isn't this cool? This is a creature living its life.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a great point. Well, this has been really insightful, and I've really enjoyed talking to you about WASP today, and I'm sure
Thank
everybody
you.
else enjoyed it as well. Is there anything else you want to share before we wrap up?
No, I don't think so. I just think I want to just share that I hope that people really do learn to appreciate wasps. No one says you have to love them. No one has to say that you have to be your favorite insects in the world.
Hmm.
But, maybe take a moment to realize just how amazing and interesting they are and how much more they are than just a yellow jacket.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Son.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links are available at our YouTube channel, PolliNation Podcast. You can also submit feedback on our website. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on Apple Music, Spotify, or whatever platform you use. Finally, if you'd like to learn more about our work to promote pollinator education and outreach across Massachusetts and New England, or register for our Pollinator Steward Certification Program, visit our website at ag.umass.edu/pollinators.